I'm painting this on a Frederick's Convexo canvas. These are the ones that have the beveled edges, so you just paint your edges and you hang them as is. You don't frame these ones. My base layer is a dark, dark, dark blue. It's phthalo blue mixed with Mars black. I ended up putting 2 layers of this to get it solid enough. I don't need my base layer to be perfectly smooth because I am going to airbrush over this, but I do want to get rid of major brush strokes, so that's where I'm using the mop brush, or in this case it's actually a blush brush, to get rid of those. I'm using a sponge brush to apply this. It goes on smoother and a lot faster than painting it with just a large paintbrush, I found. You can see there are a lot of brush strokes there. So I did put 1 more layer and then dried in between each layer till I got this solid coating. Now I am using white airbrush paint. I've got to do everything with white first because white's truly opaque. The rest of the airbrush paints, even though they say that they're opaque, they're not opaque enough. So I do all of my dots and everything that I'm going to want on there first with the white paint. You'll see me hold the airbrush up to the camera. I'm actually picking off the white paint that builds up on the tip of that needle. I take the guard off so that I can easily do that. When white paint builds up there, it doesn't spray well and it starts to splatter. So I just pull that dried paint off with my fingernail and I'm good to go. Just lots of dots in various sizes here. I want the hint of trees in the distance, so that's where I'm putting those straight white lines in the background. But I don't want them too well defined. Got to make sure to get those dots on the edge of this canvas too. Now I'm using a circle template and I'm getting some better defined circles in here. I want to make sure that I'm using various sizes. I don't want them all exactly the same. Doing everything in white like this is really, really easy because essentially when I come back on top with the color, I'm just glazing color over everything. I don't have to worry about staying inside the lines or anything like that. It was really a fast process. And here I spilled white out of the top of the airbrush because I did not have the lid on. So I've got to cover that up. Put a few extra spots there and I'm good. Now I'm starting to add in the color. I'm starting with blue. I'm using Createx airbrush paint. And I want to have a rainbow fade here. So I'm starting with the blue and then I'm going to fade up into green. To get a nice fade between the colors, I'm going from blue to turquoise. My first blue was more of a phthalo blue. So I've got that turquoise now. At this point I was tempted to paint the whole canvas that color. I love that color. Now I am up to green. You can see these are very translucent, so I just go right over everything. Now I'm adding some yellow. And I'm pulling this yellow up higher than I did with the other colors because that way when I come back through with the reds and oranges, I want that yellow tone in there all the way up to the top of the canvas. just so I have more variation. But the yellow, being as translucent as it is, it's probably the most transparent of all of those paints. I need to make sure that I've got more than I think I'm going to need, because in order to come back and add more yellow later, I would have to add white first and then the yellow on top in order for it to show up. So here it's better for me to do too much yellow than not enough, because the reds and the oranges will go right over it. So if I've got too much, it's no big deal. Now here I'm coming on top with the orange, making sure to let a lot of that yellow show through. Now I'm adding more red to my airbrush. And with the red, I want to go a bit more sparingly, because red likes to take over everything. Now I don't just want this to stop with red. I ended up going back through with a bit of purple, which I didn't film, but I did add purple in between some of these colors just to soften everything up, because that red was really harsh. Now for my aspen trees, I'm starting by painting them a light gray. I call them aspen trees, but honestly, I just painted a mess. I wasn't really looking at a reference photo or trying to do a good job, getting it exact like I will with the owl. When you paint on these convexo canvases, you want to make sure that you're getting your edges done as you paint. It's kind of a pain to go back later and try to mix the same color. Now, I am not worried about having a perfectly smooth straight line here. Because they're trees, it looks more natural if they are not perfect. If you go perfect with tape to get them really, really straight, they just don't look right. So I want them kind of leaning and curved and not straight edges there. Now the brush that I'm using right now is actually slightly damaged, and so it gives me this streaky look, which is perfect for this effect. And I'm using a dark gray. When I get these streaks, notice that the curves they're slightly curved. It's not a straight line. If you do a straight line, your tree is going to look very, very flat. There's a very slight curve there. And variation is really, really important. Now the owl's going to cover most of this, but it's easier for me and faster just to paint the whole tree like the owl's not going to cover any of it. That way when I do paint in the owl, I don't have to worry about whether or not I filled in enough of the area behind him. Now with acrylic paint, if you get paint where it doesn't belong, if what's underneath is dry, you can add a little bit of water with a clean brush and wipe that off. I get spills all the time and things where I don't want them, and you'll see me wipe it, and it's just that I'm using clean water to do that with. Now, if what you have underneath is airbrushed with a lot of water thinning it out, then you can lift some of the airbrush paint. So you do have to be careful if you are using an airbrush. But if you're just painting traditionally with a paintbrush and the previous layers have been painted on pretty thick, you can wipe off anything. You can fix anything with the airbrush or with the acrylic paint. I should probably do a video showing you guys exactly how to do that. It's really, really easy. So now I'm using straight white and adding some highlights on here. And I'm using the paint really, really thick and holding the brush at the side. I'm almost using this like you would a palette knife. You can sit and paint in with a small brush each little teeny tiny detail in the trees, but for the look that I was going here, it really would have been a waste of my time. This is so much faster and gets the same look. And my big forehead in the corner. That's lovely. And with something like this, if you get carried away and you do too much white or you do too much black, just go over it. Just keep layering until you get it right. Remember to follow that curve. And you don't want the curve too severe or that won't look right either. It's very, very subtle. It's like a medium happy face. Not too excited. The shadows that I'm adding here with the airbrush, I'm just using black paint. You can do this with a glaze. This is just a much faster way to go. So being that I had my airbrush set up, I went ahead and did it with this. But if you don't have one, you can definitely do this just by glazing the black over the area you want the shadow. This sort of thing I actually really like ivory black for. I don't normally use ivory black because it is so translucent and it's hard to get the color that I want, but for shadows it's really nice. But for the Createx that I'm using here, this is just straight black. Now I've got my owl drawn out. This was done on, I have him drawn out on tracing paper, and then I use transfer paper to transfer the outline of the owl. And this is one of the major reasons I like to have everything drawn out separately. Because if I drew this straight onto the canvas in the first place, I would have to be really careful of all my lines and details. Here, because I have all those lines and fine details drawn out on the tracing paper, I can then just block in with opaque paint. I'm using gray, both the black and the white are opaque, so their mixture will definitely cover everything up in the background. And I'm getting that solid color. If I were to do this in oil paint, I would have drawn out the owl separately on the canvas and I would have painted all those circles and the trees and everything around him. Because the oil paint dries so slowly, you have plenty of time to do that. With acrylic paint, it dries way too fast, so I recommend do this in layers where you do your entire background and just build your way forward. When acrylic artists try to paint around the subject, it's pretty obvious. So here I am just filling him in solid. Not too worried about brush strokes or anything showing in there now because this is all going to get covered. I just want a base that covers up the blues and the oranges and greens and everything in the background. I'm going to leave my owl black and white. So I want to make sure that none of that color is showing through. I'm using a Filbert Taklon bristled brush. More often than not, I will go with the Filbert brushes where it's got that slightly rounded tip because it's easier to avoid getting brush strokes with those. On the aspen trees, I used a flat brush because I wanted brush strokes to show. And then the Taklon brush for acrylic is really nice because it's not too soft, not too stiff. So now you can see I've used the transfer paper to transfer the details of my owl's face in, and I was able to just draw out the portions that I wanted. That way I could rest my hand on the canvas and not worry about smudging anything that was drawn below the head. I'm lazy. I rest my hand directly on the canvas all the time, except when I oil paint, because of obvious problems there. Now the brush that I'm using there, that liner brush, was a synthetic hog hair bristled brush. It's slightly more stiff than the Taklon I usually use with acrylic. This brush has been my favorite lately because it's so nice for getting the definite details and lines like this. Now I'm starting by blocking everything in with black and white, and I will come back through with gray tones in between, but I'm just keeping it fairly simple at this point. Now this owl, if I had wanted to paint him in color, he would have been perfectly easy to go back over and glaze like I do so often on different paintings. I could have glazed the color over him and not lost all the work I did in black and white. So painting it in black and white, even if I'm going to paint it in color, would have been a much faster way to go than trying to mix the perfect color as I made sure I was getting all my details in the right spot. Now I'm using white in between. Pay close attention to your reference photo. Make sure that every one of these brush strokes is going the direction of the feathers on the photo. That is a rake brush that I'm using there that I didn't use too much because it was the bristles on that are too uniform, so it looks very unnatural if I use that very much. Most of what I do is done with the liner brush for those little details. Now I have switched to a flat stiff bristled brush. This is one of those really cheap ones you can get at any art supply store. It's a generic one. They all have their own generic versions. They are so inexpensive for a big set, as like anywhere between $5 to $10. And it works really good for getting certain effects like this. Right here, I wanted those feathers to be very soft, and so this brush did a good job with that. Plus, it let me keep some of those brush strokes in, which created the look of feathers. When you're painting, so much of it is experimentation. Try different brushes, see if you can get the effect that you want. If it doesn't do it, try a different brush. But you have to be willing to experiment in order to find what brushes are going to work best for you for different effects that you're trying to achieve. Don't be afraid of making mistakes, because you can just layer over it. It's no big deal. If I completely ruined the head of this owl, I've got my drawing on another piece of paper. I can paint over it and redraw it out without really having lost that much time. So don't be afraid to experiment. Now the eye is being done wet into wet. So you can see I'm using a stiff round brush to smudge out those colors once I get them in there. And I'll still have to come back through and get details, but at least it's blocked in now. My earlier layers are generally just blocking in shapes where everything's going to go, so that when I come back through and start doing the fine detail, I don't get lost as easily. For me, if I try to do the fine detail everywhere and get everything finished like one single tiny section at a time, I start to lose my place. So here, if I kind of map everything out, I'll then go back through and work on each individual small section. But I still recommend breaking it down into smaller areas. Here, I'm not going to work on the entire owl until the face is finished. It makes it easier if I break it down into small sections, but I still jump around a lot as I work. Now the upper section of the eye is darker because it's being cast in shadow by the feathers above the eye. And most people and animals will have that shadow there. I've underlined the bottom section of the eye with straight white to make it just pop a little bit more. Now I'm putting a thin line all the way around, which I will glaze a black or gray color over because I don't want it to stand out that much. Those two little white dots that I put on there on the black section that's lining the eye, it makes the eye look more wet. Just that little bit of detail really makes a big difference in making the eye look realistic. Again, you just want to follow your reference photo. I'm using that stiff flat brush, which creates a lot of streaks, to brush in these bigger chunks of dark feathers. I'm still paying very close attention to the direction that each of these feathers go. Even though it's not tons of detail at this point, I still want those brush strokes going the right direction. Now the amount of pressure that you're adding to your brush makes a huge difference. If you push hard, you get thick, gloppy lines versus if you use a light hand, you can get very, very thin, detailed lines. So it's not just about the brush that you're using, but how you're using that brush, how much pressure you're adding to it, how you're holding it too. So this is another area where you want to experiment. The brush that I'm using right now is a filbert-shaped rake brush. It's by Winsor & Newton, and it won't be very good until it starts to get damaged and those bristles start to stiffen up and kind of spread out. So I've been using it a lot just as a regular filbert brush to try to get it not in such great condition. Good conditioned rake brushes don't work so well, except for the really cheap ones that are bad all the time. The cheap ones I can tell are bad because the bristles are too uniform, and so you just get this terribly unnatural look. If you've got a really nice rake brush, you get that natural look. Bob Ross, I don't like most of his supplies. I definitely do not recommend his oil paints if you're glazing, because you put down one layer, let it dry, you put another layer down and it'll lift, because his paints aren't meant for glazing. They're meant for all wet and wet. However, with his paint brushes, he has a rake brush. I think he calls it a wildlife fur brush. It is my absolute favorite rake brush. It works pretty good right off the bat when it's brand new, but it just gets better with time. And I use that for both oil and acrylic. Couldn't find mine while I was painting this, so I just stuck with this one. Now this is a Taklon bristled liner brush, and it's a little bit softer than that stiff one that I was using. So my lines are thicker, but I'm also able to get longer brush strokes out of each stroke that I make. With the synthetic hog hair, I find that I have to reload the brush more often, but my lines are much crisper with that one. When you paint owls, or even if you're drawing them, if you're working in colored pencil, you really have to watch those feathers around the face. Which direction are they going? How long is each brush stroke or pencil line? Good news, I should be moving in a few months, hopefully, and I'm hoping the way that I'll be setting up my future studio, I will be able to record my palette as I'm mixing, so you guys can see exactly what I'm doing on all of these breaks, where I'm not actually touching the canvas. But I'm hoping that'll help you guys out a bit. Now I am back to that synthetic hog hair brush, and I'm doing the finer details of the feathers around the face. This one I can get much thinner lines much easier. I can get thin lines with the Taklon bristled liner brushes. It's just easier with this synthetic hog hair one. And this one I get from Hobby Lobby. They go on clearance, they go on sale for half price about every 3 or 4 weeks. So I always stock up. So I probably paid around $5 for this one. Now, how long each of these feathers that I'm putting in here are makes a huge difference. If I go too long or too short, it changes the direction that it looks that the feather is angling at. You'll notice the ones in the center area are much shorter because those are facing you directly on, whereas the other ones, as they fan out, get longer and longer because of the angle that the feather is showing. I'm better defining now around the eye. I've got everything mostly blocked in, so this is where I start coming through and refining the details. For me, when I'm trying to judge my values and if I've got things right, I'm constantly looking up at the video camera, the viewfinder. It makes it really easy to see because then I'm looking at the painting small. It's essentially the equivalent of backing up and looking at the painting from a distance. But this way I get to be lazy and just sit still and look up at the viewfinder. You can also take photos with your cell phone of your work. Look at it that way and it'll show you things that you may need to darken or lighten up or whatever you may need to adjust. It's the lazy man's way of backing up and looking at a painting. But it can be better because, at least in the room that I paint in, I can't back up that far from the canvas to really look at it. So looking at the viewfinder or taking a photo is just the perfect way for me to really get an idea of areas that I need to touch up. When you paint fur or feathers, while you do want to copy the feel of how it looks on your reference photo, you don't need every single brushstroke to be exactly the same as the photo. As long as you've got the general feel and everything's in approximately the right location, you should be good. I mean, your eyes, your beak, the major feathers, big, like the black line that's bordering the owl's face, that sort of thing matters. That you want to be exact. But as far as the rest of the little feathers go, as long as they're close, nobody's going to notice the difference. So I don't waste too much time making sure that they're exact. I make sure that they're going in the right direction, that they're the right size and close. As long as I'm really close, my owl is still going to look very realistic. Now at this point, once I have everything generally blocked in, I can stop relying quite so much on the reference photo and start judging whether or not mine will look better if I lighten or darken various areas. As an artist, you get to make those judgment calls. You don't have to copy your reference photo exactly. And if you want to paint this owl, this reference photo came from wildlifereferencephotos.com. I have a whole bunch of great photos of owls. So I've blocked in, you can see where my white lines are now. I put my tracing paper with my drawing back over the image, or the painting, and then I use transfer paper to transfer the lines on. And you can see there's not that many lines on there. I'm going to freehand most of those because there's so much busyness that's going to happen with the feathers on there. As long as I'm close, again, that's really what matters. My bigger feathers, I've got those blocked in, but I don't really need all of those teeny little lines to be exact. That would just take so much time and it really wouldn't improve the finished look of the drawing or painting. So I'm using that Winsor & Newton Filbert rake bristled, whatever brush again. I'm not quite as picky as some artists are about the brand of the brushes that I use. I find that a lot of the generic ones, they work fine for me. I'm picky about my paint because that's what's going to stick to the canvas, but as far as the brushes go, I usually get fairly inexpensive brushes. The only reason I have a Winsor & Newton one is it was on clearance. But a lot of the art supply stores, you'll start to find, like Michael's, Hobby Lobby, Joann's, a lot of these are carrying their own generic brushes and not so many of the name brands anymore. Well, they're doing that with all of their supplies, their paints and their canvases. Their paint and canvases, that I won't go near the generics with. Made that mistake enough times. But with paintbrushes, I don't find it to be an issue. Now there are some types of brushes that a lot of these don't carry generics of, and so then I'll switch over to name brands. But if I can get it there, it's usually fine. Especially the synthetic hog hair one and the Taklon brushes are my favorites. Now when you're working in acrylic, well, even acrylic or oil, either one, when you're painting, if you're getting little dots of the canvas showing through, that means you don't have enough paint or enough water on your brush. Those little dots are something that we want to avoid, and it's something that's very, very common in acrylic painting. And there are a lot of beginner books that'll teach people to do that. It's called dry brushing. It is a technique that I avoid almost all the time. There are very rare cases where I think that looks good. It's kind of an easy way to get certain effects, but when I look at a painting and it's been dry brushed, I can tell that that artist is an amateur. So when you have those little dots showing up, make sure you cover those. Add more paint or more water to your brush. It's very rare that I see someone using too much paint on the brush. More often than not, people are not using enough. And of course, there are exceptions to that, but as a general rule, that's what I really see the most of. So I'm breaking this up. I've blocked in where a lot of the light and dark feathers go, and then I go back through and do the finer detail on one small area at a time. So I'm working on this outer section first, and I will come back through and do finer detail again later and adjust that, but I get it mostly blocked in before I move on. It always makes me laugh because people will make such a big deal out of the owl's eyes whenever I paint owls. Or even, I'm working on a wolf right now, and the same thing, people will comment on the eyes. And it's like, the eyes are the easy part. It's those feathers that are so hard. And I'm using several different types of brushes to get all of these feathers. Again, back to experimenting. If one of the brushes that you're using is not getting you the look that you want, switch them. Try another brush. This brush that I'm using right now is I believe it's a Taklon bristled brush, and it's flat. And to get the look of the feathers that I'm doing here, I'm going to do so much layering. None of these layers are going to look right until the very end. Owls that have these patterned feathers like this take so long to paint. Now, if you're working in oil paint, I do recommend let the paint dry every so often before you do your next layer. If you try to build too many layers while it's wet when you're doing this sort of detail, you can start to end up with very muddy colors, so you don't end up having any really lights or really darks. But if you let it dry, that will prevent that problem. The big thing with oil painting, I think it's a much easier medium to work in with acrylic once you get used to when you need to let the paint dry before you do your next layer. Now, one of the things that you can't really tell when I'm doing these speed paintings is how often I'm looking back up at my reference photo, non-stop checking that reference photo to make sure I'm moving the patterns of the feathers in the right direction. That is way more important than the values or colors that I'm using at this point. They have to go the right direction. You don't want to get lazy with this. A lot of people will get to where they're kind of rushing this and everything's too uniform, too much of straight lines, all the same width, all the same length, everything's the same throughout all of them. And that gives you a very unnatural look. You want to be messy here. You want to have a shaky hand too. My recommendation, have too much caffeine. If you use a rake brush, my biggest tip for that is don't try to hold the rake brush in the same position all of the time. If you don't know what I mean when I keep talking about a rake brush, it's a brush where it has bristles that stick out farther than some of the others. So it's an easy way to get certain looks with hair or grass or something like that. The problem with these brushes is if you're not careful and you don't keep varying the way that you're holding the brush as you work, you end up having too uniform of a pattern. So here you'll see that I'm constantly changing the brush. I'm constantly making different brush strokes with it where I'm turning the brush to the side and holding it at an angle, just all kinds of variations in there. And I don't leave anything that I've done with the rake brush alone. I come back through with a liner brush and better define some of those areas. Again, going back to the fact you do not want this to be too uniform. It won't look right. And it's really easy at this point, even for me. I've painted enough owls. I know that this is just a layering process, but it can get frustrating and you look at it and go, oh my gosh, this looks like crap. I should just start over. Just paint it over and start over. Don't. Keep building on what you have until you get the detail that you need, until everything looks right. If I continuously paint over it and start from scratch, I'm going to end up back in the same place. It's just a layering process. You keep layering and layering. It just takes so many layers until it starts to look right. Now, if I found out that I had put a major feather in the wrong place, yeah, I'm going to paint that over and do it again. But for these little patterns, just keep building. And when you sit up close to it, it ends up looking like an absolute mess. Think of them more as abstract patterns. If you try to look at them as feathers, none of this looks like a feather to me. So you have to start thinking of everything as just an abstract shape. It might be easier for you to paint upside down. That's a trick that works for a lot of people. So I'm going to leave those a bit and start working my way out through the wing. Now, the back area that I was working on, none of that is finished, but I've gotten far enough along there that it's time for me to move on so that I can better judge my values once I get everything around it filled in. Back to that synthetic hog hair liner brush. That one is either a number 4 or a number 3, I don't remember. When you're painting, there is not usually one perfect brush, and that brush is the only one that'll get the look that you want. Normally, there's going to be a lot of brushes that will get a very similar look. You just have to figure out what you're more comfortable working with. So some of the black areas I was just filling in. I actually have another flat brush that I prefer, but I couldn't find it while I was working on that area, so I just used the brush that I had in my hand already. Now I'm coming through and adding those teeny tiny details with the black. I'm using a thicker round brush here. No idea what number that is. Now all of the black and the white that I'm using here, this is all titanium white and Mars black from the Liquitex Basics line. I don't want to use any ivory black in this at all because the ivory black will tint it a little bit where it's not straight flat black and white. So for all of this, I'm only using those two colors. There's the brush I was missing earlier. I use that brush for so many things. It's a double-ended brush. It's flat on one end and round on the other, and I got it on clearance. It's the Hobby Lobby generic brand, but they put them all on clearance, which means they're not making them anymore, and it's sad because it's my favorite brush. I've been using that one for years. If you take care of your brushes, they will last you a very long time. They don't have to be terribly high quality to last a long time if you're taking care of them. I use the Masters brush cleaner. That is so good for conditioning your brushes and keeping them lasting longer. So you can see there I was counting how many feathers that I had. Those are I'm building up to some of the more major feathers, and so I need to really keep track of which feather goes where for those. What I like to do when I paint, because it can get overwhelming, when you've got this many patterns, you kind of start going cross-eyed. So what I do is give myself a goal. My first night, my goal was to finish just the head. However long that took, I was done once the head was finished. Then I spent the next night working on the back. I don't remember if I think I just did the back by itself. Then the next night I did the wings and the tail. I break it up into days where it is my goal to finish just this area, because it's easy. I know I do anyway. When I start painting, I will paint for hours on end and never stop and not sleep. But you also can end up losing your place and kind of making things look terrible, because this is just an abstract mess at this point. So if I give myself a goal, I'm just going to get this area done tonight, it makes it much more manageable. The white line that I'm lining that outer feather with, it's not going to stay white there. I'm just putting it there to make sure I keep those lines in. A lot of these are just little dabs and squiggles, again keeping it random, but still moving in the right direction. Now you can if you want to spend extra time and copy your photo exactly, you can, but honestly, it's just not going to make that big of a difference in the end result. It's going to look very similar to someone like me who is just getting a general feel of where those feathers go and how those patterns are. Now in this case, these feathers still look somewhat abstract when I was looking at the reference photo, but I'm familiar enough with birds. I've spent so much of my life with birds. My parents actually raised macaws and different parrots and lovebirds, so I got to hand feed those as a kid growing up. But I spent so much time around birds that I know what feathers should go where, so I knew these were bigger feathers. I was able to see that this is not just a random pattern at that point, but that those were separate feathers so that I could paint them that way. When you're working on a subject that you're not familiar with, spend some time studying. Look up YouTube videos, documentaries on that bird, or photos that show the bird in different angles where you can see the wings spread or in flight, that sort of thing. But get a general idea of what feathers go where. That way when you're working on something like this that just has so many crazy patterns, it'll make it easier for you to understand which is a large feather, I can't talk, which is a large feather and which is just some crazy pattern within that feather. They say that for writers all the time, write what you know, and it's really the same for artists. Paint what you know. If you don't know something but you're interested in painting it, spend some time looking up documentaries on YouTube. This is a great time in history to be an artist because there are so many things out there that will help us educate ourselves so that we can paint all kinds of different things and do so very accurately. One of the things that I like to do before I paint lions or like I did a cheetah a while back. I will watch a short documentary of it just so that I can see the movement of the animal to make sure that I'm capturing that in my painting. Well, yes, I'm copying my reference photo. I still want to make sure that I'm aware of certain things, the way that the shadows fall, just how each of those legs move, so that I don't end up with a very stiff looking painting. Helps me anyway. You guys probably won't see me paint an owl for at least a month because, oh my gosh, I was sick of feathers by the time I was done with this guy. Now, one thing I will say too, this one, I wanted him and the trees to be completely black and white to contrast the rainbow background and then the bubbles that will come up later. It is actually easier, I think, to make something look realistic that you put color over. Leaving something in black and white, you are so dependent on making sure that your values are correct, which is great. I mean, for teaching yourself to get your values right, it's great practice. And I do recommend doing that with glazing. But if I had gone over or knew that I was going to go over this with color later, I wouldn't have worried so much about everything being just right in black and white. Because the color can actually hide a lot of different problems that you may have with your values. I was tempted to paint him in black or put a glaze of color over him just to simplify things for myself, but it wasn't my original design, so I sucked it up and painted him how I intended. Oh good, one of my hermit crabs is awake, so you guys get to hear that banging around. So you can see I had those feathers that were curved and drawn out, but once you paint in all the patterns, you kind of lose it. You don't notice that it's so much of a feather. And this is where I was talking about. It's a good idea to have a general understanding of your subject so that I knew those were feathers, because while it's subtle and it may seem like you could just paint those abstract lines all over the place, it really does make a difference in the end painting and making them look realistic. Because anybody who is familiar with birds will catch it if you're missing whole feathers. These longer flight feathers were much easier to keep track of what area I was working on. So I'm blocking in the bars that are on each of those feathers first. Now lining the feather so that I don't lose track of where I'm at. When you use a white charcoal pencil or transfer paper, make sure that all of those lines are worked out in your painting. You don't want those showing through. You can see I'm painting right over them. If I use a charcoal pencil, that tends to leave a little bit of color. It'll smudge in with my paint, but I can cover it up by another layer of paint. With the transfer paper, it doesn't smudge as much. But the transfer paper also doesn't erase as well. So I need to make sure that that paint is completely covering it. So those patterns that I was working on earlier still follow through on these flight feathers, but I need to make sure that each of the flight feathers are individually well separated from the other. Don't think that you can save time by being lazy and using a sponge or just dabbing paint all over the owl's feathers to create that look. There are no fast and easy ways to do this and have it look realistic. Trust me, I tried. When I was younger, I used to try everything to come up with a faster way to do things, and they looked terrible. Take your time and paint in the detail if you are going for a really realistic look. The wave that I painted a week ago, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, I don't remember now, but that one, if you remember the sea foam, I kind of stabbed the canvas over and over again with white paint and a stiff brush. Don't do that when you paint animals. I can't think of a single time that would look good. Unless you're working for more of a craft look, like toll painting and that sort of thing, that is not a technique you want to use. It saves time, but it looks terrible. You definitely want more control than that. Now getting these thin lines, I'm using a slightly bigger brush than I would than like with the liner brush, but I can get as thin of a line with that brush as I can with the liner brush by how much pressure I'm applying to the brush. Because I'm not pushing very hard and I have a good mixture of water versus paint on the brush, I can get thin lines with that if I want them. So it saves time than having to continuously switch between a liner brush and that brush if they can both do the same thing. Now there are times that it would be easier to use a liner brush, but for something like that, I was already using that brush. It's faster just to make the brush I'm using do the same thing or the same job. Remember, as you're working, don't put random lines for the sake of details. If you're just making details and they're wrong details, you're wasting your time. It's not going to make it look better. It's not going to make it look more realistic. If you want something to look realistic, you need those details to be very accurate. So you've got to pay close attention to your reference photos. So often when I see students work, they will glance at the reference photo and then spend 20 minutes staring at their painting or doing all of this detail without looking at their reference photo again. That is not a good way to go, and it shows in their end work. You want to constantly look back at your reference photo. Whoops, hit the camera. Onto this foot. Now this I'm not going to be terribly detailed with because I know bubbles are going to cover almost all of it. But I do want to make sure that some of it, the parts that show through, are accurate. So it is drawn accurately, but I'm not going to make sure that it's as detailed as the rest of the owl because very little of this is going to show through. So this is where having a design and knowing where you're going with a painting is helpful because I know where I don't need to waste time. So now I'm using the airbrush with black paint. You could just do this by glazing if you want, but again, I've got the airbrush, so I may as well make it faster for myself. And I'm adding some extra shadows in there. Because right now the owl looks flat between all of my blacks and whites, so this is where I need to start building up some of that variation. Make him look more three-dimensional. Now some of this I will go too dark with, and that's okay. I can come back through and lighten it up with paint again later. And what I'm doing right now is softening out a lot of these feathers too. One of the things that I found is that most of my feathers, when I do this in acrylic, they're a bit too harsh. If I work in oil, it's easy enough to soften that out, but with acrylic, with it drying so fast, it's so easy to end up with these really harsh, wiry lines. So by glazing over it with another color, or in this case just airbrushing it, I can soften a lot of that out. And I'll come back through with white and soften some of the feathers over the back as well. It just kind of pushes them all back together so that they're not quite so harsh. Now at this angle, it looks like my head is way too wide. It's just the way that the light is hitting it. The face isn't quite that much brighter than the rest of the owl. Although I did highlight the face on mine more than the reference photo, because as much as I want it to still be realistic, I also want to make sure that your attention is pulled towards the face. But not quite as much as it looks here. Now I'm using white and coming back through and softening up a lot of this. Now, I'll have people ask me occasionally about using the airbrush with oil paint. Really, you don't need to. With oil paint, it dries so slow, you can get the same effect without it. I would not run oil through this airbrush because they clog bad enough as it is. I don't need to ruin it with oil paint that does not want to come out. I've heard of artists doing it. It's just not something that I would be willing to do. And I don't see a reason for it. Now I'm going to start working on the branches. I've drawn them out first with a white charcoal pencil. And this is another area. Most of these branches are going to get covered up with the bubble leaves, so I don't need to have them quite perfect. And that same brush that I was getting those thick lines with, just by turning it to the side and adding less pressure, I can get those thinner lines with. Those were really, really thin lines, and that is a very large brush. Now I'm adding the highlights, again, keeping the line slightly curved. When I get out onto those thin, skinny branches, I don't do the curved lines anymore. I just throw some highlights with some random thin and thickness. That did not come out right. I can speak English, really. With some random, some of them are really thick, some of them are really thin. If I do an even straight line all the way across the top half of the branch, it's not going to look natural. So you can see there's variation in there, and that's really, really important when you're doing branches. Don't try, or anything really. I see so often where people will highlight things and they highlight the whole thing evenly and it doesn't look right. So now I'm drawing the circles for where my bubble leaves are going to go. For this, yeah, I can freehand it. It's not like circles are that hard to paint, but it's so much easier to use that charcoal pencil to draw them in, because then I can see, okay, that bubble was way too big, I need to adjust this, or things like that. It's much easier to make those adjustments when they're in charcoal than they are if you've painted them in and decided something didn't look right. So now I'm going to paint those bubbles in first with just straight black and white, the same black and white that I used on my owl. I am putting black on the upper section and smudging it downward. And I'll actually do that on quite a few bubbles at a time before I go back through with the white. And they did do a video showing you guys how to do simple water droplets and bubbles. I'll try to remember to put a link to that in the video description. If I forget, just leave a comment and I'll look it up for you. I always say that I'm going to find links when I record these videos, and by the time I get them uploaded, I totally forget about it. I have no memory. But these are very easy to do. Now I do adjust mine a little bit because I will put some more dark areas, varying lights and darks inside these bubbles so that it looks a little bit different than a water droplet or water bubble that I did on the video that I talked about. But that video is still a good base to start with, where I've got the darkest area on the top and then the lightest area on the bottom. And this is opposite than how you would think it would be. Most people would think that the lightest area should be the top and then the shadow on the bottom. But these are translucent things. So with these, I will have a shiny spot, the highlight on the top, and the light escapes through the bottom. So the bottom is really where the lightest area, the largest area is going to be, where the tops have to be dark in order for that highlight to show up. Now, when you want to get more advanced with bubbles, look up some bubbles that people have done with the soap type bubbles that they'll blow with the kids. Look at those because you have so much variation in those where your highlights and shadows are. But generally the same thing, wherever your light source is, whatever's around it needs to be a little bit darker for it to show up. And then the bottoms where the light is escaping, that whole area will generally be lighter. But with those soapy bubbles, they get some different really cool effects with the colors. And I will do a few bubbles at a time where I do the line and then smudge them out. When you're learning, I recommend do one bubble at a time. Draw that line and then smudge it. Draw the line and then smudge it. Once you get to where you've done enough of them, you can work your way through faster where you can do several at a time. But the paint dries too fast to do too many like that. So if you paint kind of slow, do them one at a time. Now I am mixing the white. I'm thinning it out with water, using the liner brush to line that in, and I will smudge that upwards. Now my white bottom areas are going to need to be a lot lighter later on, but for now this is just kind of a base. And you can see I've outlined the majority of that bubble with the thin white line. I pull that under section up quite a bit. Not all the way though. I'm not completely circling the bubble. That won't look right either. So you can see now I'm smudging that white in various patterns throughout the bubble. I'm getting other highlights besides just the bottom and just that top shine. The brush that I'm using to smudge this with is an older brush. It's a Taklon bristled brush that's really, really damaged. The bristles are going in every which direction, but it's still soft, so it works so well for this. So if you damage a brush, save it, because you can get so many different effects with damaged brushes that you can't get with brand new brushes. Not that I'm encouraging you to damage your brushes, but it's bound to happen sooner or later. So hang on to those. This is very similar to painting grapes, where I get those random highlights and shadows within the bubble. If you remember the demonstration I did with the grapes, I had a lot of variation in there. Now I am glazing color right over those. I want varying shades of green, blue, I think I have some yellow and a peach color that I used for these. And I don't want them all to be the same. I want them to have that hint of color that I used in my background. And for these glazes, I'm using a fair amount of water and a much smaller amount of paint so that they're very translucent. You can still see everything that I painted underneath. Remember, when you do a glaze, do not use an opaque like titanium white, because it just fogs everything up. There is no white mixed in with these glazes. And the layering that I did underneath with the black and the white, that is completely dry. So if you're working in oil paint, make sure you let that layer dry first before you start glazing the color over it, or you'll just make a muddy mess. So my orange color is a bit of yellow mixed in with red. I don't typically buy orange paint. I just mix it myself, because red, yellow, and orange are all colors that I use so sparingly that it doesn't make sense for me to have a whole tube of orange. Now I am using red mixed with a violet or purple color. I didn't want red down at the bottom here. It would pull too much attention where I don't want it. So I've just mixed a bit of purple with it, so it tones it down a bit. But I still get that rainbow effect. You'll see I keep dabbing my finger over it to pull up paint. If I got it to where it's a little bit opaque, just by dabbing that with my finger, I can lift some of that paint off. Not a technique I recommend if you're working with oil paint, because some of the colors do have lead and different things in them that can be very toxic. But for acrylic, it's non-toxic, so we can use our hands. Now I'm coming back through with that liner brush. I'm using that synthetic hog hair brush that I used so much. Actually, no, that one's not the synthetic hog hair. That one is a Taklon bristled brush. But I'm underlining the bubbles and then adding that final highlight on top to make them look really sparkly and shiny. And while the highlights are all in the general same location where the light source is going to be the same, they are not all the same shape. I'm getting little squiggles and different patterns in there for that. Again, variation is a really good thing. One of the things that you can do if you are wanting to paint bubbles, they have those glass ball grape things. If you get those, that'll give you a general idea of how to do a lot of the shine. I should probably get those for myself. Those would be handy. And that is it. One last tip that I have for you guys, if you're going to do something that's very surreal and kind of off the wall like this, design it first either in Photoshop or by doing a sketch in a sketchbook. Make sure that that's going to look right and be well balanced, because some of the ways that I thought I was going to do this, I found out in Photoshop that it did not look good. So I had to make adjustments to the design. It looked great in my head, but not so hot when I actually saw it put together. So at least sketch everything out when you do weird things like this, or ideally Photoshop makes it really easy to be able to tell what is and is not going to look good. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below.